public discourse has been in the last years quite brutalized. We have seen an increasing discussion not only about opinions but about facts. That what is actually the truth? The alt-right movement or the right-wing movement overall has taken much more the grip on the public debate, and that they have invented new words, for example, we've seen a word like goodness signaling, like that you're trying to look like a good person. Has been a word that has been very used in the right-wing extreme dark corners of the internet, but it's been more and more mainstream, and it's been picked up by the mainstream media. We have certain persons on Twitter or so-called experts, and so who are using these words in their social media, and then via them it's been used, and that is influencing the public debate quite a lot. The right-wing parties of the middle, the democratic right wing, so to speak, they have very much tried to get the voters back by being better Sweden Democrats than the Sweden Democrats, trying to compete on their field, like the Conservative Party, for example. They try to say that they are also against migrants and a lot of different policies that the right wing parties are against, and this has pushed the other parties, like the Social Democrats, as well, to compete on that field. We have the Green Party, for example. They tried early on to say that they would be competing to be the third biggest party, and that they would take on the challenge to say something different than the Sweden Democrats or the fascists. And they kind of lost that war. They were very pinpointed by the Sweden Democrat. They had Muslims on political positions, for example, that they were forced to kick out a very influential politician who was accused of having extremist connections, for example. And so the whole party tried to stand up for him. And with that, the whole party was out in the cold. And now so it was a difficult strategy to try and not talk about this, to try and talk in a different way. A lot of people have actually stopped being public influencers in certain political fields, and that it's been very difficult to talk about migration, feminism. The human rights debate has been a battlefield again, so that we're not agreeing on human rights the way we used to do. So it's the strategy of splitting us up is really working. I saw some study that the left wing or the progressive part of Twitter in Sweden has gone down to half. So the brutalizing of the public debate, that you get threats, you get bullied in different ways. A lot of people have been becoming quiet, and you can see that in among journalists, for example. It's in these issues where they know that they're going to get very hard, that the debate is going to be very hard. A lot of them have withdrawn. Public service and the mainstream media is getting more competition from what should I call them, boy room blogs. People without facts, without fundamental press ethics, is getting more viewers than the mainstream media that is operating in a professional way, so that you don't have the fact checking, you don't have the press ethics in very big public opinion makers. And so they are having much more influence now in setting the agenda, and that is also influencing the journalists and the NGOs that we even seen in the public sector, where organizations is actually acting on like fake news, or if the fascist party is asking a question to a minister, this is actually taken action by. Before, that would be like, okay, this is not fact, this is not relevant, and you would put it aside. But now things that come from these blogs is everyday matters in the NGO. Mainstream media wouldn't do that because they would check their facts first and then they would ask the questions. But now it's like the facts are coming from much more from the alt-right, and so and this is actually something we have to handle. So when you take a stand, you get attacked, and then not only from bullies or from internet trolls, but also from the mainstream media and from public bodies. Campaigns specifically against like the Muslim civil society, and then all the organizations in the civil society that has some kind of link with these Muslim organizations who defend them, they also get attacked. So it's like very difficult to defend these organizations because you will get attacked yourself. You get threatened. We have the Save the Children now, who are threatened to get to lose their funding because they have a person employed who is in the board of the Muslim Study Association, who is approved and get their funding, even though there's been a lot of criticism against them. The right-wing extremist campaigning influencing Save the Children, which is it's very scary to look at. In the Swedish debate, we have the American politics is very influential. We look a lot of at the Trump campaigning and laugh at the Trump campaigning a lot. And we don't always see the parallels to what is happening in Sweden. A few years ago, we had the Social Democrats in Denmark were like a bad example. And a lot of people were discussing that we should not go the way that the Danish Social Democrats has gone, trying to compete with the migrant criticism or the Danish example as a bad example within the Swedish Social Democrats, that we generally we didn't want to go in the Danish direction. We were having also debates with the Danish Social Democrats, and we were seeing like the whole populist movement in Denmark as a frightening example of where we shouldn't go, because we were discussing that we need more hope, we need a more progressive stand on like how can we live together, because what is happening is not that you don't only close the borders, but you also make a marginalization of the people within our country, which is like the working class is very much ethnified in Sweden and more every time. So that the Social Democrats would go in a different direction, a more inclusive, a more migrant positive direction. And then something happened. And now the Social Democrats are very much more on the Danish Social Democrats pathway, and I don't know really what happened, but this is something that has been, we hear from leading Social Democrats that Denmark is a good example. Bernie Sanders has been a very important figure among left-wing politicians in Sweden, and also among Social Democrats that want the Social Democrat Party to go in different direction than what is happening right now. And Bernie Sanders has been a good example with a lot of movies from the Bernie Sanders campaign, for example, where, and I am among Bernie Sanders fans, the solidarity between different groups has been very important in that campaign, I think. And because that is what we are lacking, I think, in Sweden right now. The Bernie Sanders campaign has several viral videos that very to the point say something different. Black people standing up for the rights of poor white people, for example. And that debate we don't really have right now. Like this, we are lacking the energy, maybe because we don't have this solidarity or like this vision of what society we could have. The responsibility of the Social Democrats, like to unify the working class with the middle class and try to find an inclusive language.
Statements that would be quite taboo a few years ago have now moved from the margins to the mainstream. And this happened, I would say, approximately 5 years ago at the height of the so-called refugee crisis. You saw an intensification of populist and nativist rhetoric. And also the refugee crisis provided this structural opportunity for actors to present themselves as protectors of an endangered nation. Now, Norway is characterized by prosperity, a robust welfare state. So radical right discourses are centered primarily on culture accounts of difference rather than economic grievance. So these actors I have studied in my research, they vary both in ideology, orientation, and legacy, but they converge on particular topics and grammars of exclusion. So the last years, we've seen how the figure of the Muslim migrant or the radical Muslim have been used in political mobilization, partly as a way of protecting the imagined purity of Norwegianness against outsiders. And also, I would say that Islam and Muslims have been framed both by the populist anti-immigrant Progress Party as an existential threat to Norwegian security and national identity and culture, than culture grounded in Christian values and heritage. Now, we've seen in Norway, like elsewhere in Europe, we've seen that the worrying effect of the electoral gain of the radical right is that mainstream parties draw their policy agenda to the right in an intensified competition over these volatile voters. If we look at the Labour Party in Norway, they have tried over time now to consistently oppose the anti-immigration and anti-Islam rhetoric of the Progress Party, and at times also quite successful. Now, under the former coalition government, where the Progress Party was in a coalition government with the Conservative Party, the former Minister of Justice has to step down after she posted a very controversial photo that associated Al-Shabaab terrorists with the Labour Party. And this is also, we have to remember that Labour members has been targeted in 2011 in the worst attack on Norwegian soil since the end of the Second World War. And that year we have the right-wing extremist Anders Behring Breivik, who was once a member of the Progress Party that killed 77 people in these twin attacks. And one was targeting the then Labour Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg's office in Oslo, another against a Labour youth camp on the island of Utøya. So there's a constant effort to push back on associating the Labour Party with too liberal and lenient policies that are responsible for the so-called Islamification of Norway. Now, how has the Conservative Party reacted to populist or the radical right? Well, it's now a word that's describing Prime Minister's Erna Solberg's style of governance, and that's the Solberg parliamentarism. So it means that she, instead of confronting them immediately, she, of course, was in a quite successful coalition government with the Progress Party, but she's also quite quiet in the boat. So it means that she has issued apologies on behalf of her government before, but it usually takes her a few days to respond. So she's in this kind of balancing act where she's not able to confront them entirely, particularly not when they were in a governing coalition. And she's very careful with the words she uses to describe particular actors and phenomena. And in terms of how has NGOs reacted, I would say that they are fiercely lobbying. You have anti-racist NGOs that are challenging conspiratorial myths or racism on a daily basis. I would also say that you have responsible journalists in Norway that care about not only social democracy, but also the protection of minority rights and human rights in general. that are also challenging these very essentializing images from the radical right and reintroducing human stories, the human face of migrant communities, the human face of minorities. So really trying to bust essentialist accounts. And thirdly, I would also say that mainstream parties, now if we look at also Labour Party in particular, have also tried to define their own agenda on this issue. So not just parroting populist politics or trying to move their agenda to the right to gain those voters they have lost, but really trying to define their own agenda when it comes to issues such as immigration, when it comes to issues of Norwegian values, way of life, and whether that or not is on the strain. So I think that's also one successful strategy, is not to parrot populist politics, but to really define the agenda yourself, and what do we need, what do we think, and what kind of policies do you want to develop based on these issues? So in the Norwegian context, I would say that there is concern with defining the agenda and not also talk about taboo subjects or to challenge politically correctness in a way. And I would say there's less silence surrounding potential inflammable issues such as immigration and Islam than a few years ago. It means that that kind of space for discussing these two issues has opened, it has widened, and it has multiple actors involved. But you also see the social Social Democratic Party and actors are also involved in that conversation. Now, if you compare that to the Swedish context, where the Stefan Löfven and the Social Democrats have been accused for silencing these issues, for not talking about these issues, which has hence led to the sharp increase of popular support for the Sweden Democrats that have taken ownership to these two issues. But they have also taken ownership to defining what is Swedishness or national identity in Sweden. And the past few years, we've also seen the resurfacing of a similar discussion in Norway. So what is Norwegianness, national values, national identity? And this conversation was also then initially kind of hijacked by the populist radical right actors. But we see now it has been taken back, in the sense that you also have other actors that are discussing what it means to be Norwegian way of life, values, identity, but in a very inclusionary manner. So they're trying to have more ownership to issues of national identity. I mean, there's lots of inspiration among, as we know, all kind of political actors are cooperating in this age of hyperconnectivity, and they're drawing inspiration from successes and also learning from failures elsewhere. But what we see clearly in many European countries, from the Netherlands to Hungary to Italy, you see actors that are parroting populist politics. So they move their agenda to the right. So social democratic or conservative politician that will incorporate populist agenda in their policy or rhetoric. In Norway, I think it's a similar tendency, but also more open discussion about around these issues.
The rise of AfD has brought a very great success to the right-wing extremist movement and hate speech spreading in Germany, in German social media, and the public discourse has changed. This refers to the normalization of ethnocentristic vocabulary and ideology, which has been normalized, and certain shares of society radicalized as well. Violence increased, and even right-wing terrorism is explained as a result of the normalization of ethnocentristic and racist speech and ideology throughout society. So the debate is that democracy is quite in danger, even though followers of right-wing extremist parties or right populist parties as AfD are a clear minority, and even they seem to have reached a level that they can stop. And in the most recent surveys, they even seemed to lose some support. Nevertheless, we have clearly seen that conservative and liberal political actors have been not that strict on their national party's decision not to cooperate with the right-wing extremist parties, especially AfD, but they have explained that it might be useful to cooperate in some points, especially on the local and regional levels. And the decision not to cooperate with the radical right was on the national level, but on some local levels, the personal and institutional connections are rather strong, and actually conservative and liberal politicians used the partial cooperation with AfD there to build a counterweight to left and green party politicians, which caused quite a lot of scandals for especially, or for instance, because they voted together with AfD against other candidates. They voted for AfD candidates for head of city councils and so on. And in general, in society, the debate about the shifting of the limits of the speakable and the immense flow of right-wing vocabulary and racist ideology into everyday life is discussed very much in Germany, and civic society activists and left politicians have a strong consensus that this must be fought back, that this must pushed back, and they clearly see the dangers for democracy, of course. The main question in the civic society and in the media debate about the far right and how to react is, in my opinion, the question whether such opinions have a legitimate place in public discourse, in public discussions, and should be given airtime in media and overall attention. And the problem is that society and the media has partially given in to the far-right call for freedom of speech and anti-political correctness according to the far-right definition of these terms. Thus, in Germany, the far-right's urge to gain influence on societal debates, the argument that there is an overweight of minority representation, which disables policies for the majority, and liberalization of society might gone too far because society loses its center. This is very popular in the political and societal mainstream today, and one general debate is about the alleged conflict between the social question versus so-called identity politics. And even left and Greens has have taken this argument, have adopted it, and argue about the social question versus so-called identity politics. And we see that ideologies of the far right have entered the main discourse in society. In the meantime, many politicians and public intellectuals in Germany nowadays speak out against political correctness and radical left intolerance. It has become astonishingly popular in everyday life in Germany to ridicule gender mainstreaming. It's clearly a reaction and a defensive reaction to the international decolonize and Black Lives Matter movement, which has become visible in Germany as well. So we see that this regressive reactions to liberal and pluralistic democratic movements are very strong, even in the political mainstream. The newest media hype is debates on intolerance, leftist cancel culture, often as an excuse to repel even the modest forms of criticism. So we see on the one hand, right-wing extremist and far-right ideology has made its way into the center of society. On the other hand, we see that civic society activists and leftists try to keep the debate open and try to scandalize the shift to the right. I'm not sure if the discourse in Germany is influenced by transnational developments that much if it comes to a reaction to the far right, which is very one point that is very strong is the discussion about populism in general, and talking about the US, talking about Trumpism, or what's going on in Bolsonaro's Brazil and so on. The European perspective, especially what's going on in Scandinavian countries, isn't reflected that much, in my opinion. A strong debate about what I said before, the discussion whether or not the social question must be highlighted to fight back anti-democratic tendencies, to overcome the increased mistrust in democratic institutions and democratic parties. This debate is transnational, and it's very strong actually in the center-left political parties in Germany, and they see or they highlight that there are important tasks like on a more general level to strengthen inclusive solidarity in society and European solidarity, defending pluralist democracy, its values, safeguarding democratic debate, and highlighting participation on a national and European level. And I think there is a consensus that convincing and more convincing concepts for future welfare state development are needed, and social justice and cultural progress has to be strengthened. It is highlighted that we need a strong new narrative of today's and tomorrow's society in order to have a striking counterweight to the regressive, reactionary, and authoritarian ideas of yesterday. And basically, that's it, I think.
In Finland, the Finns party has been entering the political scene quite strongly since 2011, and it is of course related to the radical right and the emergence of radical right. Their discourse has been penetrating the other parties in to large degree in terms of mainstreaming the discussion about migration, which is not always a bad thing, but also in terms of racism, xenophobia, and even misogyny becoming more visible in Finnish political life through this. And the role of women has, of course, been important in Finland, like in the other Nordic countries. And here there are limited roles to women, as some of my colleagues have been studying, Tuija Saresma in particular. The political left and right have sought to cooperate to some degree with the Finns party because they saw it as a parliamentary party and there was no cordon sanitaire, the kind of blocking out of the Finns party in Finland. And this is an important issue. That also means that that this kind of blocking itself did not raise much of the party itself. The former party leader, Timo Soini, in fact, explained how it was really a strong position for the party when it was completely on a different political stance than all the other parties. And that sort of polarization, which is core of my research, was able to lift up the Finns party. But here in Finland, that didn't really happen. So now other parties have been collaborating with the Finns party in government, and therefore some of the ideas that they have been mainstreamed in policy level. This cooperation has also turned the Finns party into more economically right. So currently, as they are in the opposition with the National Coalition, which is a right-wing party in Finland, both of their discourses are more or less on the political economy right. So they are trying to contest the government of being left-wing. And this has, of course, turned the Centre Party, that is a junior partner in the government of Sanna Marin, of SDP, they have been turned into more left-wing in this discursive situation. So the Social Democratic Party has, of course, taken seriously the competition from the Finns party, and they have been recently then turning more to their social democratic left-wing roots. For instance, in the defense of the factory workers, and Sanna Marin has been showing her social democratic stances in the left side of that party. And this has been seen as a possibility of getting back to politics some of the voters who have not been disillusioned with the Social Democrats. Again, with the Greens, the Greens have been very much oppositional of the Finns party all the time. So they position themselves as the counterparty of the Finns party, and that doesn't necessarily then showcase their own policy preferences. So that is the same to some degree with the Left Alliance, that is also a government party. The NGOs, some of them have been very critical of the Finns party and formed themselves against that. Of course, there are also some associations that are closer to the Finns party itself, so it's got its own NGO field. So, but there has been, of course, mobilization against the Finns party emergence, and it has sort of politicized politics in Finland in a good sense as well, because people are more interested in politics. So the emergence of the Finns party is not necessarily a bad thing. because it makes people discuss what is important in politics and what should be addressed. So that has, of course, done that. Of course, after the 2015 migration situation, there have been a lot of NGOs that have been otherwise also forming. So they happen to be also, of course, against the Finns party policies. We could say that in Finland, the transnational cases that are discussed are, of course, the Sweden Democrats in our neighboring country, and to some degree, of course, the Brexit situation in the UK, and some degree the rise of AfD in Germany and Italy, of course, with the Lega. And this is interesting because the parties do collaborate. Some of these parties collaborate in the European Union in the same parliamentary section. So perhaps the most inspiring transnational experience for the Finnish radical right has been the case of Hungary and Viktor Orban there. And some of the Finnish party leaders have been giving supportive statements of Orban's actions. It used to be so that the Finnish party leadership was very much tuned into what is happening in Norway and Denmark as well, because Timo Soini, the former party leader, actually wrote his master's thesis about transnational cases of populism that he could then be following with his own party, then the Finnish Rural Party. But it has been, to some degree, a bit less in the public now. The social democratic parties have been, of course, following the example of other parties, but it's perhaps not as much discussed because the Danish way of social democracy is quite different from the one in Finland. So Sanna Marin has taken a slightly different reappropriation of the social democratic roots, and this does not include sort of nationalism and anti-migration discourses at all. It's rather the opposite for her. Further on the left is perhaps more visible that there is collaboration between the Left Alliance and other parties and think tanks. Somehow the Finns, of course, tend to think that their Finnish way, their own sort of consensus, which includes like the three large parties, where the Finnish party now has moved as the fourth one, and now we are wondering whether the Centre Party will remain as a large party or whether the Greens would be overtaking them. They tend to see themselves as a special case. So there are, of course, some transnational movements that do take part, and there are people who are taking part in those movements, whether they are like kind of alter globalization movements or whether there's like trade unionism or other things involved. But somehow our slightly different party system perhaps has made the Finns more prone to just look within their own circles and then try to sort of copy less of what is outside, because it's not always as easy to integrate these types of workings into the Finnish politics.
I made recently a study about the strategies of the Social Democrats from the late 1990s until recent political developments. When we speak about the radical right populism in Denmark, we speak predominantly of the Danish People's Party, of course, which is a kind of a textbook when it comes to Scandinavian populism, but not only. So in the past about 2 decades, since the rise and consolidation of this party and the political influence that it achieved in 2001, the mainstream party's responses have been different. They have varied from forms of dismissal and ignoring the role played by the Danish People's Party, particularly in the 1990s, to positions that have focused on, first of all, accommodation of the political issues and the political agenda brought in by the Danish People's Party in the 2000s to achieve more recently a convergence towards forms of cooperation, if not co-optation of the party agenda of the Danish People's Party. The Danish People's Party first emerged at the end of the 1990s as an anti-immigration, anti-Islam, strongly nationalist and ethno-nationalist, I would say, and welfare chauvinist party. Since its inception, the party has been overrepresented, particularly among what goes under the white working class. That means both skilled and unskilled workers. Well, this fact of having a success among this group in the Danish society created a challenge to the social democrats and particularly to traditional social democratic voting constituencies. At a time in the late 1990s, beginning of the 2000s, where the social democrats were decreasing their appeal, their electoral appeal overall, and the traditional class voting was on the downturn. So, I mean, this obliged somehow the social democrats in Denmark to adopt strategies on how to confront the Danish People's Party in view of the fact that the party was appealing to. At the end of the 1990s, the idea was predominantly to dismiss the party, not a normal parliamentary actor, but more as a pariah, and later on to also attempt to ignore the party. But things change in relation to some particularly critical junctures, and this was obvious in the 2001. I mean, not only the political system in Denmark changed remarkably in terms of change of positioning in relation to, for example, class voting vis-a-vis issue voting, where issues such as immigration, such as also environmental issue or LGBTQ issues came to the fore, but also in relation to the terrorist attacks. This created a dramatic change in how the political agenda of the electorate relied and considered important or salient some of the issues, and particularly in relation to questions of immigration and in relation to the cultural role of ethnic minorities with another cultural and religious background than the native Danes. So feeling of fear of being socially dispossessed when it comes to status. So all this, let's say, created somehow a change in also the public opinion attitudes towards immigration. And what is remarkable these days is actually that things haven't changed that much in relation to the skeptical positions that we might observe among the public opinion, no matter if actually things have developed in a positive direction in terms of increased integration of ethnic minorities, lower levels of criminality and higher levels of labor participation and so on. But this, let's say, are not probably not enough in order to create a change of attitudes, and particularly to change fears among certain swaths of the population. So if we come to how the Social Democrats have reacted to this, there's been a shift which is remarkable in at least from 2015. This is remarkable also because, I mean, it is something that is promoted by the party, and in particular by the leader of the party, Mette Frederiksen, which indicates also a paradigm shift in the way the party has dealt with these issues in earlier years. Underlying the fact that rights were for all as duties were for all, but also putting a lot of effort making clear that equal rights mean equal rights also in terms of non-discrimination, to avoid targeting certain groups as the problem, which is what actually happens right now. The implementation of politics that started under the center-right liberal and conservative coalition governments and continued under the social democratic minority government that promote, for example, stricter rules on asylum, a paradigm shift that means that the asylum doesn't give any certainty as for the permanence of the stay in the country. Also, as for targeting underprivileged and underprivileged, urban neighborhoods with a higher density of ethnic minority as the problem. Really targeting these groups as responsible for their own lack of self-responsible for their own lack of positive integration. Also, several scholarly studies observed that out of the absorption attempts that have happened in 2001 under the liberals and conservatives, we have come towards attempts to contain the populist right-wing wave by simply co-opting some of the same issues, which is problematic in the sense that, I mean, if this choice might regain some of the votes that the Social Democrats lost to the Danish People's Party, it might also as well shed some of the voters that perhaps do not find these positions of the Social Democrats in compliance with the social democratic tradition and let's say spirit. The legitimization strategy or the accommodation strategy that was adopted by the center-right and by the liberal and conservative minority government in 2001, and which actually continued for more than a decade, changed a lot of the political situation in Denmark, also as relates to the reactions from the civil society. This was made obvious also by, to some extent, the reaction of the traditional media, which, contrary to other countries, such as, for example, Sweden, accepted more the role played by the Danish People's Party without very many controversies or questions about the role of the party, in particular the positions of the party in relation to immigration, Europe, and discrimination and forms of racialization that we have observed. Danish developments as specifically Dane and also in the understanding of an exceptionalism, perhaps within the Scandinavian context, or at least vis-a-vis the developments that have taken place in Sweden. I mean, this opposition in between politically correct Swedish way to go about that, perhaps to some extent is considered disrespectful of freedom of speech and the freedom of press and so on, contra the Danish way to go about. This is somehow the understanding that we see in the Danish context that perhaps has been let's say prompted and aggravated also by the way the Mohammed cartoons in 2005 were first of all understood within the Danish context, which have been reactivated also by recent events in France.